Hi, sorry, are we using video?
I think you can if you want to.
I mean, if no one's using video, then I mean, we can just not do video. Um, okay, so I suppose the consensus is we're not going to use video, right? Then. Madam Chair, I want to begin my speech by first defining the key terms in this motion. So what do we mean by legally liable? We argue that in order for individuals to be legally liable, there must be a responsibility accorded to that individual to perform or act in a certain way. And in order to be legally liable, the offender also has to have both the intention as well as the act itself in order to be held legally liable and responsible for that particular criminal act. Next, what exactly is a recidivist crime? A recidivist crime is a double punishment of after the offender has experienced the negative consequences of that particular action. So we're basically looking at repeat offenders. So what's our policy in order, what's the policy for today? We argue to you that in the event of a recidivist crime, for instance, where a robber commits the same offense after serving his sentence, the judiciary in a state of the highest order, for instance, the Supreme Court in Singapore, will look into the case and determine the certain parties, the certain state organs and institutions who may have contributed to this repeat offense. Some examples would include holding the executive liable, for instance, for not conducting proper surveillance of the offenders, or even lapses in the duties of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, who has an intrinsic responsibility in ensuring these crimes are not committed again. But more likely, we think, is that it will actually impact judges in courts who may not have executed suitable punishment or judgments that may have led these offenders to recommit their crimes yet again. For instance, a hardened criminal will probably not be deterred back into jail for the third time and may likely commit the same crime again. Therefore, we argue that by placing these individuals and these state executives into the spotlight, it ensures that these kind of state executives pay more attention to the kind of punishment, especially for the legislature and the judiciary, pay more attention to the kinds of punishment being meted out and to look and to shift the focus away from simply being a deterrent to the rest of society, but to a more curative solution in order to see whether they or not they can actually reform the individual and what are practical benefits and outcomes of having that particular punishment in the very first place. So what exactly is this debate about? We think this debate is about whether or not these repeat offenders are totally supposed to be at fault because of the state and whether or not the state should be legally liable for the repeat offenses of these individuals. Because recognize that these kinds of repeat offenders are still human, are still individual beings. They still have decision-making calculuses, they still have an identity and an individualism within themselves. This means that the way and the matter of calculus in which they go about committing a second crime, a repeat crime, is usually contingent not only on their own kinds of previous biases, but it's also basically affected by the kinds of external influences that's placed upon this individual. For instance, if the individual feels that going to jail is something that is insufficient to deter him from his life of crime. For instance, if he is a kleptomaniac and really likes to steal things, then probably going to jail isn't going to solve this problem, but rather it's just going to be a temporary stoppage to his life of crime. Furthermore, who do we think is affected? We think that the main people who are affected are usually criminals who realize that the state will get, who realize that their actions will be scrutinized not just by the state, but also the kind of judgments they receive will be more curated to the kind of problem that they bring to the state. So what is our stance for today? We believe that the justice system to mete out punishment that is curative, that can actually be effective in enacting positive change within the country itself. So this is a sharp move away from the current jurisprudence principles of crime of deterrence. Because we agree that the kind of tenets of deterrence and incarceration are all important things. But what we think is sorely lacking in the system is that in the process of trying to uphold all these other tenets, the kind of curative solutions that punishment ought to also bring for the offender is largely neglected. And that is why under status quo, we want to bring the focus back to the kind of curative potential that punishment can have and to analyze to what extent can this individual actually be reformed through the kind of punishment that we meted out. Because the kinds of consequences, as our later go on to show, the kind of consequences that will eventually flow from a repeat offender committing the same crime again is going to be extremely problematic. I have two arguments for the House today. First, how are we going to ensure more suitable punishment for the offense itself? And second, how do we ensure a better protection for the state in general? So first, under status quo, we argue to you that repeat offenders usually don't fear the punishment of jail term that much because they are probably already so hardened to it, especially for repeat offenders. Like going to jail for a third time for like another 5 or 6 years isn't really going to like make me extremely fearful of going to jail because I'm already so normalized to it. But the way we change the status quo is by making state institutions and state systems, especially the judiciary, more aware and keen of the way punishment punishment is being meted out, such that punishment itself has to take into account its effectiveness in turning this person away from the life of crime. You have to look at the state receiving, for instance, significant backlash in the form of public interest litigations, politicians losing out on votes, and people in power possibly even being fired. But what is most important, we argue to you, is that the outcome of this is that the states probably have to reconsider the way in which judgment is meted out. For instance, if the process of sending a criminal into jail is probably not going to solve and turn this individual away completely from the life of crime, then possibly sending this individual to jail isn't going to be the best solution. So the state probably has to take into account other kinds of curative measures, such as undergoing psychotherapy, or whether is it going through counseling sessions that may potentially have a better productivity and better outcome for the rest of society, actually change this individual for the better. And the second argument I want to bring to the house today is how it helps better improve the state in general. This is especially important, for instance, in the case of traumatic crimes, for instance, those of rape and those of severe physical assault. In these kinds of instances, we argue to you that the victims themselves are extremely traumatized by these kinds of effects. And the potential and the consequences of having a repeat offender come out onto the streets and do this crime again, repeat this crime yet again, is going to be something that's extremely damaging, not just for that repeat offender, but also for the victims that were involved in the crime. For the repeat offender, repeating the crime a second time because he's not learned from his supposed lesson of deterrence is only going to make him even more hardened in the future. These are the kinds of negative consequences that I wanted to talk to you about earlier, right? When at a point in which he feels so normalized to being in prison, that he just goes in and out and treats it like a temporary vacation stay. But second of all, we argue with you at the point in which victims themselves realize that this person is not only like is like out of jail and also going to repeat this crime again and has repeated this crime again. It shows a fundamental failure in the system to possibly bring about justice within the state itself. So we argue to you that ultimately the means in which the state has to consider the kinds of judgments being meted out, the kinds of considerations that the executive body, for instance, has to take into account is all extremely important. Because, for instance, the lapses in the kinds of institutional bodies, such as the Internal Security Administration, as well as the executive, in terms of conducting surveillance on supposed repeat offenders, are all things that have to be kept in the spotlight and have to be scrutinized so as to prevent the kinds of repeat offenders from happening again. Because the kind of consequences that flow as a result is extremely damaging, not just to the victim, but also to the repeat offender himself, who feels that it's okay for him to do these kind of things, and therefore it creates and thrusts the state into the spotlight and creates more responsibility for the kinds of laws and the kinds of punishment that's being meted out. In conclusion, this measure and our policy aims to achieve a situation whereby the state takes into more consideration the kinds of positive benefits that will accrue as a result of meting out a particular punishment. This affects the way we view jurisprudence in general, and looking and treating the kinds of practical and positive benefits as important as the kind of deterrence that we want to talk about. For these reasons, we can be proud to stand on government.
Thank you, PM. Let's hear from LO.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just going to start my timer. The role of the CJS is to basically uphold the rights of every single individual, even the people who they sentence for a particular crime, is to give fair verdicts and to have proportional verdicts as well. Now, our aim in this particular debate is to show you how this particular state is principally not liable and how this will lead to like unfair verdicts and how it is not good for society as a whole when there already exists a system of check and balances, which is democracy itself. So, first, a few rebuttals to side opening government, right? They tell you about how in order to hold a person legally liable, they must have had the intent and the capacity to make a change in this particular situation, right? Now, understand very clearly that if this particular, when the state releases people from jail, they obviously have checked whether this particular person has been rehabilitated, right? Understand that 100% rehabilitation measurement is not possible in like the current status quo, right? You can't possibly be like have an accurate judgment of whether this particular person has been 100% rehabilitated. You do end up having screening checks, and when they meet the criteria of 90%, etc., that is when you release them, right? Already the state does whatever it can to maximize the kind of the kind of rehabilitation that currently exists in the current status quo, right? Where they do this kind of screening checks, and it's only then that they release these particular people, right? They've designed sentences already in proportion to the crimes they commit in order to ensure that people successfully rehabilitated, right? So we don't think particularly the state ever has this intent of just sending people out of prison even before they are rehabilitated. But our major constructive of why we should principally not hold the state legally liable is particularly very important, because we believe that each individual has a variety of spectrum of opinions and experiences to choose from. Each individual has free will to be able to choose which circumstance or experience they want to use as the backdrop to make a decision in this particular circumstance, right? That is, all individuals, at least those who are released from prison, because if they were mentally unstable, they would not have been released from prison in the first place. They are rational beings who can process what the law states and understand which experience to choose from. Right? Should I choose from experience A, which tells me to do this particular crime, or experience B, that is the experience I had in prison, and the experience of the court judgment, which tells me that I should not do this particular crime. Right? We believe that they do have this particular free choice. The state is in no way responsible for this particular individual committing these crimes when the state released these people with the assumption that they would be rehabilitated and they're most likely not going to commit this particular crime. So we do not understand what is the principal logic behind them committing this particular behind them holding the state liable. The second constructive that we have from our side is the side government just makes this absurd jump, which is to say that if you suddenly hold the state liable, they're suddenly going to make reforms and do all this sort of internal security, right? There's a logical link missing. That is to say that we need to look at what is the most probable option that the state is going to choose if you start holding them legally liable. Now, as a state, the easier option for me and the option which has less expenditure is to just put people in for longer times in jail, right? That is to say that now they will not, because even if I do all this kind of security checks and these the cameras and all these kind of psychological therapies, etc., I will never be sure whether this person will recommit this particular crime, right? So now the governments will just not want to take the risk and will sentence these people for more amount of time, which is not proportional to the particular crime they've committed, right? And understand that in prison, you take away inalienable rights, right? You prevent them from interacting with their family, you put them in rooms where they have hardly any sort of enjoyment in life. And when you stop when you take away these particular rights and you sentence them for longer time, it's not proportional to the crime they've particularly committed.
I'm POI.
I think you're serving the particular role of the CJS system, which is to give fair verdicts, which is to give proportional verdicts, which is to uphold the rights of every single individual, including the people who have committed these particular crimes, right? And now, what are the consequences of these people having to spend a disproportionate amount of time in prison? Basically, now that when they have to spend a longer amount of time, that is for 5 years instead they'll spend 10 years, for 15 years instead they'll spend 25 years. What ends up happening is that even it worsens the current situation, because now if after 25 years they're going to get released, then the possibility of reskilling or the comparative advantage of reskilling and leading a particular better life is going to be much harder for them, right? And as a result, we think it's going to be much tougher for them to sustain once they get out of prison, because you're going to sentence them for longer time. Furthermore, their families are extremely affected, right? When you're going to sentence them for disproportionate amount of time, and these families would probably not have a breadwinner, and as a result, they would have to go through harsh times for a substantially long period of time, and as a result, the children probably would have to enter lives of crimes in order to sustain them. Third reason why we think this is particularly harmful is because now that the state has to is held legally liable, and now they have to put people in prison because they just can't take a risk because it looks bad for their PR, etc. What they'll end up doing is that they end up doing racial profiling, right? That is to be because they can't take the risk, they will already use the pre-existing racial biases in order to put people in prison for longer periods of time, right? For example, a black person in America is considered as someone who's probably more violent and probably more aggressive, right? So this stereotype is going to make them sentence these particular people for even more longer periods of time, right? And it's like a negative. Basically, when they start sentencing these people for longer periods of time, it again just reinforces this particular racial bias and this racial stereotype which exists in society, making it even more problematic for these particular communities.
Ma'am, POI.
discrimination against this particular community is not taking, not taking that in this particular stage. Now, all of this would be fine if there existed no other counter mechanism for like better safety, better security of the particular citizens, right? That is, the government's case would still be valid if this was the only way to get like reforms, right? But we tell you it's not, because democracy itself offers the best natural system of check and balance, right? That is to say that if crime is particularly bad, and if it is considered as a priority for the citizens, they will vote in those particular people who would like have like perhaps more stricter reforms and probably like have better policies regarding crime, etc. Right? Instead, they will choose more holistic measures where they probably increase the number of police force, perhaps pay these people more, rather than actually just stating to the people that, you know what, we're already taking particular policy decisions, like, you know, like we're just like kind of, because we're legally liable, we're anyway sentencing these people for more amount of time, and as a result, they'll just like escape away from this particular responsibility that they have as a government to actually provide better amenities and like better security for these particular people, right? And then for all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, LO. Let's hear from DPM. Here.
Hi, just give me like 20 seconds. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, can I start? Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right. Madam Speaker, the frame with which opening government operates in this debate is very simple. The fact that states in themselves operate on fear of losing their power. They operate on fear of losing their legitimacy amongst the eyes of the people. And obviously, all of the benefits that OO tries to bring to you in their counterprop are much better held on our side when you have a tangible lawsuit that is against you as a government. Therefore, all of the reformative measures that they talk to you about in terms of, say, increasing police forces or the betterment of jails are surely something that happen better in our side when you have this particular deterrent to actually try and ensure that these particular things are happening and that these repeat offenders are not existent within our society, right? Recognize how their counterprop is so easily subsumed and rather better implemented in OG's case, because stricter reforms exist in our world the moment you actually have some sort of a motivation coming in to say that these particular lawsuits exist. You are fairly going to be someone who is going to take stricter and certain immediate measures as the state, and being the state, given the entire complex and very sophisticated policy analysis that Darren has just talked to you about. I think we take this debate simply on the counterprop, but fairly let me provide to you some extraneous rebuttals about how they talk to us the principle of how whatever was the very muddled and murky analysis that came from LO, which basically can be summarized by saying that people have free choice, and that free choice is something that the state should be able to recognize, and that the state is not supposed to be held liable for. Well, I see your principle and I raise you another principle, right? The very fact that the moment that these particular criminals have broken the social contract, not once but rather more than once, it becomes the responsibility of the state in and of itself to protect the rest of its citizens who have not breached the entirety of their social contract right now at this point in time, right? The way to the breach of this particular contract is something that has happened already, which is why these people are rogue in the eyes of the state, and the state needs to ensure all measures to make sure that these particular repeat offenders are not doing crimes again in and of themselves, right? We think this looks like two things. Firstly, maybe providing harsher sentences. We are absolutely okay with that, because recognize what the point of justice is. It is threefold. Firstly, restorative justice, to ensure most importantly that people come out as reformed individuals, and the moment that they cannot do that and there is clear proof, they talk to you about 100%, 90% rehabilitation. But the moment I commit the exact same crime again, obviously I am a person who has not learned from spending 5 years in jail. And even if engaging with the best case scenarios that these jails are really shitty and all of that, I deserve to be there for a much longer period of time so that I can definitely learn my lesson, right? Secondly, we feel the point of justice is reformative, right? To give some sort of, to reform it, to give some sort of like solace to the particular victim that is actually taking place at this point in time. And we feel that it is at that point in time, principally when the state owes a legal obligation to the victim of a repeat offender crime, such as someone who has been sexually assaulted by a known sex offender. We think that it is at that point in time when the state should be liable to a lawsuit from that particular individual or from the Ministry of Internal Affairs actually opening an internal investigation into their case in general, right? Lastly, we feel that the point of the state and the justice system is to obviously win public support, because unfortunate as it may be, media controls a lot of narrative right now that takes place within our justice system, right? And we think that the moment the state knows that it is going to be, that its name is going to be slid through the mud in media, which is to say that the newspapers in the international community are going to run entire stories on these particular states actually having been held accountable for a lawsuit, we think it is far likelier that they're going to improve their punitive measures. How? In two ways. Firstly, like I said, by giving out harsher sentences, which we are absolutely okay with, right? Their principle of fair and proportionality of crimes and all of that doesn't necessarily stand, because these people are rogue in the eyes of the state, and as long as they cannot be reformed, we do not want them as a part of our society, which is the very principle on the basis of which we do incarceration and take away your right to ownership of self-property, or which is why we give capital punishment, and the state has the right to take away your life in general, right? We then feel that their last point coming in is about racial profiling and how these particular repeat offenders, it'll be easier for the police to actually just try and like profile black people. We think this is a complete assertion, simply because this debate surely lies in a sphere where a black person has actually committed a crime twice and not before actually having committed that crime, right? So if their argument is that they are going to give black people longer sentences because these black people are more likely to commit that crime again, we simply think that that is not true, simply because these particular people are liable to then the entire democratic checks and balances system, which they so easily talked about, right? The moment you see that your judicial system is handing out sentences left and right on a much longer basis to these particular black people, we think that argument doesn't stand in a Western liberal democracy sphere, and that is why we think that OO is simply out of this debate, right? Furthering on what we have actually talked to you about, right? We think things like jail, people being in jails, this looks like actually someone who has broken social distancing and is in jail for 6 months with someone who is a serial killer or who is like a murderer, is more likely to become a criminal and to make a repeat offender crime, because of the fact that these particular cliques or communities that form within these jails in general in and of itself, right? Where you have jail gangs forming and so on and so forth, which is what incentivizes people that even if they have come in for petty crimes, they go out and then they start leading that life of crime because of the bonds that they create within this particular jail or while being incarcerated. We think that is sufficiently problematic and worsened on their side of the house, which is basically status quo, because of the fact that the state has literally zero incentive to ensure that these particular criminals or these particular jail cliques are not forming. It is in our world rather where they would actually form certain different sets of like jails, for example, for different types of offenders. It is in our world where the politicians, because they're scared to shit about the fact that they're going to lose their seats, they're going to lose their power, and they're going to be essentially shamed by the international community, that they are more likely to put more money, to inject more money within the justice system. It is going to be much better as a society to live in on our side. We have told you 4 things about the principle that the state needs to be generally held accountable, because the moment these criminals go rogue, the state's responsibility is to protect the rest of these citizens from having actually had repeated offender crimes in the first place. Secondly, the fact that state punitive measures are bad right now, right? We agree with all of their analysis about jails being really shitty and all of that, but we feel that that is far worse on their side when the state has zero incentive to ensure that these reformative measures actually take place. The moment you have fear instilled in the eyes of the state, they will actually ensure that they are actually improving these particular things. Lastly, we told you about how public trust within the system is significantly decreased when repeat offenders are seen in the news in general. And we think the moment the public realizes that they have the power against the state, that they have some sort of ability to ensure that they can file a public interest litigation against the state and they can actually sue the state is when they will actually try and like have more trust within the state, because they know, and it is then when entirety of OA's analysis about these checks and balances stand. O is definitely out of this debate because of the principles that we have forwarded to you and because of our practical benefits, because states operate on fear and because we solve justice much, much better on our side. I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM. Let's hear from DLO. Here.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Just give me 20 seconds. I'll start. Okay. Cool. I'm starting. Madam Speaker, understand what is the goal of the criminal justice system, right? It is basically to ensure justice, and that is threefold. A, fairness, B, proportionality, and C, that it has to be good for society as a whole. Given this, let me first rebut side OG and tell you why we clearly take it over them before I go ahead and extend our case, right? So first of all, understand that OG starts in their proves our arguments, right? Why? Because understand at the point of time at which states have this irrational fear, or politicians just are filled with fear about whether they lose their jobs, it is way more likely that the state will now want to avoid legal liability at all costs, right? Because simply because this legal liability is so problematic for the state, right? Understand that at this point, they wouldn't do what OG suggests, but they'll try to minimize liability to begin with, right? And how will they do this? The very easy way to do this is to go ahead and keep the convicts in jail for longer, or to prevent convictions for reoffenders, because if they get convicted, then the state is legally liable, right? And we tell you this is far more likely because it's way more easier and it's far more problematic than like whatever OG tries to suggest, right? Understand that it's much easier for you to do this than to go ahead and release them from prison and to go take the risk of being held liable, or to go ahead and let the conviction go take his normal course and be legally held liable, right? This is the kind of problem that happens because of the morbid fear that is created. Again, all their analysis proves our arguments, right? But thirdly, understand the point that OG makes is about, you know what, you can now have probably other curative measures instead of jail. Firstly, understand that this is problematic because now the state, even if it explores the curative measures, is going to have a huge incentive to go ahead and prevent conviction, and maybe go ahead and try to do these curative measures extrajudicially, however, still legally, right? For example, leveraging their influence to get them to go ahead and enroll in certain rehabilitation centers and sponsoring them, whatever. Even if they do this, we tell you the extrajudicial nature of these interventions, which is going to be extrajudicial simply because the state doesn't want to be legally liable, is highly, highly problematic, right? But secondly, understand all these curative measures are still possible in the status quo, right? They're not mutually exclusive. Why? Because if the current rehabilitation system is not working, and you see that there is a significant number of people reoffending, then your reoffense becomes a major issue, right? And when reoffense becomes a major issue, people are going to raise it, and it's going to become an electoral issue, which means the state has to deal with it in order to stay in power, and therefore these essential checks and balances already exist, right? However, what this leads to is, if this is not the major problem, it leads to the states focusing on the wrong problem and letting crime increase in society in general, something I'll explain more in my construct. Right? But please don't interrupt, just raise a placard, please. So understand on the last point that OG makes, right? If they're rogue, then we don't want them to be a part of society, right? Understand that at the point at which you're releasing somebody, there is no way to predict whether they will reoffend or not. That means all of OG's case, in the best scenario, will be blanket applicable to all convicts, right? And that is hugely problematic because it's simply not proportional and it's simply not fair, right? It violates the principles of the criminal justice system. And again, that proves our arguments, right? So what did we tell you from side opening opposition? Our first argument is the principle behind liability and why in principle the state is not legally liable, right? You hold someone legally liable only if they committed the crime. That is, if they had the intent and the capacity, right? Understand, well, the state does have the capacity. The state has zero intent whatsoever in order to like go ahead and do this, right? Because understand that one of the responsibilities is to prevent crime in general. But secondly, understand that no individual chooses the circumstances, right? We get our circumstances by lottery of birth. If different people have different circumstances and they have no control over this, they don't choose this. However, within the circumstances, how you choose to live your life is totally under your control, right? And therefore we see people from the same community with the same circumstances, like some people going ahead and offending, committing crimes, etc., and some people coming up and having upward mobility, right? That is to say that there is free will existing given the circumstance that you are in. And this is true for all people, right? Whether you're offenders, whether you're re-offenders, or whether you haven't committed an offense whatsoever. And therefore, if you're telling me that the state is responsible for the circumstance of this re-offender, it's also responsible then for the circumstance of the, it's also equally responsible for circumstances for the others, because none of them chose the circumstances, right? But we don't hold the state responsible for all crimes that are committed. Why? Because we recognize that the state is not the one committing the crime. We recognize that people have the free will to do it, and we recognize that they're not legally liable, right? And therefore, the same principle applies here. We tell you that the state is not legally liable. Not taking that now. And understand, when you go ahead and still do this, it violates the fairness principle of the criminal justice system, right? So moving on to our second argument, which is why it is likely to harm all convicted people, right? On the first level, understand you can never know for sure if they've been rehabilitated 100%. And therefore, it's always a risk for the state to go ahead and release them, because if you release them, they could probably go ahead and reoffend. And if they reoffend, you'll be held legally liable. And if you're held legally liable, it's problematic for you. And therefore, you're going to go ahead and make sure that these people spend more time in jail than is necessary, right? And you're going to curtail their rights more than is necessary, violating the proportionality principle of criminal justice system. But secondly, understand, when you increase the sentences for everybody, it's going to lead to overcrowding of jails, because nobody's going to go ahead and build jails. But even if they do, the pace of convictions is going to be far higher than the pace of construction of jails. That is to say, there's going to be overcrowding in general. And this overcrowding is an additional punishment. I'm not taking yours. It's an additional punishment in and of itself, right? And we tell you this violates the proportionality principle further, right? And the state is going to do this simply because it's the easier option. But on the second level, understand the public and media focus is going to be on the cases where the state is held legally liable. It is not going to be on the cases where people do not reoffend, but on the cases where people do reoffend and when the state is held legally liable. Why? Simply because the business interest and the ratings of the media and the greater interest around it and the greater sensationalization around this. What happens then is that every particular ex-convict is going to be seen as a potential criminal. And this is problematic because it's going to worsen the stigma around ex-convicts, and it's going to make it more problematic for the vulnerable communities who are stereotyped. This is what Anita was talking about in her speech, right? So moving on to our third argument about how it prevents a holistic approach and actively harms the society, right? Understand, given the electoral responsibility and accountability that already exists, people are going to want the state to reduce crime in general, which is the state's responsibility as well. But at the point of time at which, let's say, reoffense is not the primary problem, but something else is, you're necessarily forcing the state to focus on the wrong problem, right? We would rather have the government to be flexible enough to look at crime holistically instead of forcing its attention towards what may not be the primary problem, right? Because it is legally liable, and therefore you're constraining its ability to reduce crime overall. What happens as a result? It means that the government cannot fight crime in general, and that means crime is going to increase because you're focusing your efforts in the wrong direction, right? And this is problematic because it actively harms society because of your inability to combat crime in general. You're harming the society, right? What have we proved to you from side OO, which clearly makes us win the opening class, right? We told you why it's principally unjustified. Secondly, we told you how it harms all convicted people and how that's not fair or proportional. And thirdly, we told you how it prevents a holistic approach and actively harms society. For all these reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Chair, OG wants reform. OG wants to improve punitive measures and and they want the state to improve measures so that recidivism rates are lower. But this doesn't exactly tell us or prove any liability or causation, because states can always do better, but it doesn't prove to us why states were directly negligible or directly responsible for all the harms accrued by the criminal or the victims. The second thing is that if OG supports things like reform, recognize that we can have it too. We aren't against reform, but the fact that they merely want states to improve reform and to improve the criminal justice system doesn't give us a reason to believe why states were directly negligible or liable to begin with. but recognize that OG is counterintuitive simply because they want reform, but they also want states to spend millions of dollars on court cases and defending themselves, because recognize the money we use for reform will be the same political capital that states will now use to defend themselves in courts. Recognize that if they say that the political capital is already existingly low and that states already don't care about the criminal justice system, these are these same states who will find any ways to escape legal liability. And we tell you that for every floodgate of court cases that will now exist, this is a waste of taxpayers' money, and this is a waste of federal budgets. Because recognize that suing the state is an extremely ineffective system, because states will always win against anybody else because they literally have a federal budget at their disposal, as opposed to other individuals or other NGOs who sue them, who oftentimes not only have financial constraints but other constraints too. Secondly, we say that it's very hard to prove causation, and oftentimes it's merely a waste of federal budgets to create a media circus which will never work for actual reforms. CG then says that they won't punish the state if the state has already fulfilled all their duties. This is an extremely gray area, because we don't understand how much the state needs to do so that recidivism isn't exactly their fault. Like, does the state need to provide a perfect education reintegration system? Does the state need to do what does the state need to do to escape legal liability? But also, we think that the fact that they will blame the individual or the criminal for doing recidivism after their state has apparently done their part, we think this only gives states an excuse to do the bare minimum and blame the criminal for recidivism anyway. So this is counterintuitive to any benefits they want to accrue. First extension. Why it's very hard to prove causation and is oftentimes ineffective. Firstly, recognize that state oftentimes operates on a limited budget and resources, which means that states will never have enough to have a perfect budget for states will never have enough to have a perfect budget for all industries like healthcare, like police, like this criminal justice system, for military. They will never have a perfect budget. And if they cut budgets in any system, in any sector, people will die anyways. This is literally an excuse for states in courts. When if you want to hold states legally liable for not putting enough money in the criminal justice system, for example, or not having the perfect reintegration system or the perfect system to prevent recidivism, I think states can easily get away by saying that they were just merely harm minimizing and putting money into sectors where most people won't die and most people will benefit. And oftentimes, criminal justice system isn't the one, which is why states can oftentimes remove legal liability from themselves. The second reason being, recognize that oftentimes a lot of factors that lead to recidivism is out of the state's control. A lot of factors like the individual itself, because recognize you can give an individual extreme amounts of therapy, but if an individual refuses to accept that education and reintegration, individuals will still have recidivism anyways. All this means that although there will be a floodgate of cases in court, it's very hard to hold states in and of itself legally liable, which means that all these defense mechanisms that states will use to hold themselves not liable is merely a waste of resources of the state. We think this is an harm, because these are money and capital we can use to not only get actual reforms for the criminal justice system, but also for other sectors to be, for example, be able to use it for welfare or improving the conditions of individuals so you can prevent crime in and of itself. But also, we think that before that, sure.
Do you realize that the states will actually want to save this money spent on these court cases, which is why they will ensure that their punitive measures are reformed?
Exactly. It's so much cheaper to go through court cases and so much more effective, because recognize we have given you mechanisms to prove that states are the ones who will usually win those court cases. You need to tell us why causation will exist so that states will actually lose those court cases. We tell you that the point at which states are able to win those tort cases, it's so much cheaper and like it's less blame put upon them, as opposed to actually reforming the criminal justice system at that point, because that actually proves that they were negligible to begin with and that they were at fault. If states never want to be at fault, and if states always want to push the blame to other individuals, other sectors, we think that it's far easier for them to go to courts and win those lawsuits, because that literally proves that they were also in desperation and they also couldn't do anything beyond, and all these recidivism happened beyond their control. Them wanting to reform at that point shows that states were not negligible in the first place, and we think those are harms that states will not want to take onto themselves. Just recognize states care about publicity. States care about the media attention towards them. We think that it's very difficult, and states will never want to accept fault to begin with, which is why I don't think that they will want to reform the system. But secondly, realize that any reforms that they want on their role are also counterintuitive to begin with, because they need to tell us why states will have enough money to defend themselves in court, but also use it for reform. Just recognize all these things aren't on the top budget when it comes to election processes, and it isn't very popular. States will have to cut up a lot of money from other sectors to be able to do reform and also fight lawsuits, which is why we think states will not take that burden, and states would rather just defend themselves in lawsuits and prove to society that they were negligible to begin with. But secondly, in terms of what CG says, we think this makes it far worse, because this is when states will end up being able to shift all blame towards individuals to begin with. States will never be able to perfectly do enough, and the legal system will eventually draw a line, because they need to make laws clear and like the standards of state liability clear. The legal systems will eventually tell society what are the standards where states fail. The point at which the standard is already set, that's all that states have to do, and we think this will be the bare minimum, and recidivism will still continue anyways. You need to tell us how you're actually able to achieve the effect of having states have an incentive to reform the system, because recognize states are extremely more powerful. States not only have more money, but also are able to do things like, for example, legal intimidation to every layman who wants to sue the state. Every time an individual tries to sue the state, they systematically fail. Hence, we think this is an ineffective policy. We rather use the same political capital for reform.
Okay, thank you, MO. Now let's hear from GovWhip. Here. Thank you, GovWhip. Now let's hear it from OpWhip to close the debate.
Test. Test.
Yeah. Yeah.
Panel, all of opening government and closing government's benefits are contingent on the state accruing liability via the judicial system. That is the only incentive they have to carry out any of those reform options. Let us be clear on opening and closing's clash. CO grounds OO. Everything that OO wanted to push to you about the harms of the system, about the harms of that system, have no impact if we don't give you the fact that criminal systems become worse, that jails becomes worse off, and they don't make sense without the perverse incentive of justice systems that came from closing opposition. We're going to adhere to both houses of the government bench. But first, let's go with CG. Recognize that the only liability that this structure can win over the government is that if they win in a court case, if a judge proves that the government was at fault. I question the idea of that ever happening. The first thing that CG says that contradicts this idea is that CG said that governments will only be charged if they are negligent and they don't administer punishment properly. I think that gives you zero liability to push to any of the government. That means that the government just has to say, we did everything that we could. We are technically discharged because we have fulfilled our belief. Because notice the fact that the government will always say they've done everything that they can. The government will never fully agree to a guilty plea in front of a court because that means a failure of their own systems and it means an increase in the amount they have to spend on rehabilitation systems. I think those things are not contentious in the political sphere because people don't really care about prisoners. What government has a political incentive to invest in the sector of society which no other sector immediately cares about? No POI. I am confused as to why there is any liability over there. But also for the fact that this means that all the government, all they are supporting is a trial where there is a huge asymmetry of power. There is a chilling effect that comes from this. There is a reason why Brown v. Board of Education, why Thurgood Marshall, why the repeal of Jim Crow laws are so infamous and famous in history. It is because it is almost impossible to win a ruling over the state. What lawyer is there that wants to rob the house of the state? That is something that creates intense media attention. That's something that will shame you if you lose, and in most instances, you will. This means also that the mass majority of public defenders have no incentive or no ability to properly question the resources of the state, to question attorney generals and people who have been properly picked to conserve the money and conserve the pride of the state. Also, the second thing on rehabilitation. If the only possibility is that a state can be held liable is where people actually win, then I don't understand why there would be such an incentive for rehabilitation. I think that what's more likely is that courts are going to be more violent with their sentencing, right? Notice the fact that they ignore that judges have reputations on their own. These judges do not want some criminal to come up and question the state. This means you're likely to impose sentences that go on after you die as a judge because you don't want that kind of backlash coming back to you. That means you also have less likelihood to give rehabilitation to these people because you don't want them to be in a position where they are happy enough to be able to come back at you. I also think this idea that they're going to get all this money from rehabilitation is extremely ludicrous, right? Rehabilitation of the system is expensive. This is converting San Quentin prison into a Scandinavian facility. It's not just retraining some kind of psychologist, it is implementing different kinds of guards. It is repainting the facility. It's doing all of these different things. If the system is as broke as you say, I don't see as to how a lawsuit would conserve more pride and more money for the state that they can use to win over winners, to win over votes in other sectors of their administration. And there's also a reason why there should never be a blanket punishment to these individuals. The closing government conceded themselves that these individuals commit crimes based on necessity. If that is true, then you are worsening the punishment of individuals who otherwise should be let off lighter because it is the fault of the state. We say that in any world, when there is no additional burdens for the government to defend, smack away, that is the world by which they're able to defend, they're able to be more willing to invest in systems where they have less pride on the line, they are less willing to sacrifice that. No. Opening government. Opening government brought to you two ideas broadly: variability and reform. The thing they said from PM was that they're now going to have the ability to scope out different kinds of punishments. Fine. If you want things like rehab, things like, different kinds of sentencing, I don't see how they don't exist under our model. All those things already exist within judges' systems. Judges already take into account whether a person needs rehabilitation, whether a person needs to go to jail. I also think they take into account mitigatory factors, which increase the pressure for give a good sentencing, right? If we live in a world where the sentencing of Brock Turner brings about huge amounts of massive discourse, that is increased pressure on judges to get the calls right. Under their world, you have an incentive to impose further punishment so these prisoners can never get out to sue you, but also there is a higher complacency because the big daddy of the government can bail you out with all their lawyers and you're never under any kind of scrutiny. I think there is less reform as a state. OG has had to answer, if the government implements all of their reform and the criminal still reoffends, is the state liable? If opening government says that political capital for reform is so low, and to hold them accountable is this punishment, then this is a state that is always going to avoid liability. Suing the state puts you at an adversarial position with the most asymmetric powerful thing in the community. It's over 6 minutes. reasons why the judiciary will always side with the executive. Notice this is a response, not new material. There are many instances of prioritizing the executive under status quo. Even under status quo, criminals aren't allowed to sue because the state knows they're going into a black hole of funds the minute by which someone has a case against them. It is cheaper to hide a lawsuit, to keep a judge, to not have to replace and find new judges. All of these states also have vast incentives to never admit defeat. I think the criminal justice system gets so much worse. Correct, it is not that good right now, but there is so much more for you to lose. We don't have to prove things get better, only to get worse. Things like adequate diets for prisons, things like warm water, things like having more decent guards on payroll that are willing to like sell out prison violence and sort out those kinds of things. All of those things have significantly less funding the moment by which you decide you want to waste a black hole of money onto these kinds of things. Even if it's not in the criminal justice area, I think you screw over people in other sectors who require their money. We say that we never had to prove why the state gets better, only that government side is willing to abdicate, is willing to screw over, is willing to make prisoners suffer on the large scale. Proud to oppose.
Thank you.